Okay. Hilchos Basar בחלב, Siman Tzadik Dalet towards the end. Just a couple more nekudas on the last that we did the design about cutting a piece of meat with a Melicha knife, and then we'll go on to see test and test. We were introduced by the Ramah to Ne'itza Bekarka as a form of being machshir a knife. Ne'itza Bekarka does occur. It is suggested in several places. It's not very common, depending, of course, on what happens exactly. Usually, a sakin would either require libun or hagala, depending, of course, how it is used. That is the din on hagala, is that, or when you're being machshir kelim, depending on how it's used, that's how you are machshir, whether with fire, whether with hot water. And something that's used always with a kli sheni, you could be machshir it with a kli sheni, just pouring hot water on it, which really is irui, which is better than kli sheni, but that would be sufficient. You wouldn't have to do a full-blown hagala if you know for certain this kli is never used more than with it. So that is actually an additional suggestion, perhaps, in Hilchas Hagala. We tend to just make hagala. We tend to just put everything that requires hechsher in water in the same degree of water. We don't say, this is going to require kli sheni, this is going to require iru. You just do everything, just do it hagala, and hagala covers all bases. Unless, of course, something needs libun. And libun, speaking about libun, in Hilchas Pesach you will encounter there's something called libun kal, that sometimes is used. Libun kal can be used, of course, elsewhere, not only in Pesach. That involves not necessarily the highest temperature in the oven. Highest temperature in the oven, as you know, especially if it's a self-cleaning oven, it could be 800, 900 degrees. Or at least over 550 if you want to be makel. The highest possible for ovens that are not self-cleaning, the highest possible temperature for what the oven is used for baking and so forth. So that would be sufficient. Even though in Pesach we're machmer, and that is why you will see using a torch. There are some svaras that allow one to raise the temperature in a regular oven that is not self-cleaning to the highest temperature for an hour or two. After, of course, it was cleansed very, very well. After it hasn't been used for a day. And even then, some people line the oven with aluminum foil so as not to, have anything left over come onto whatever it is making for Pesach. If you don't put anything directly on the floor of the oven, but on those grates, then you're even safer. There's quite a bit of a distance between the grate and the walls of the oven. So these are just some of the details when it involves hagala and libun. As I was saying, libun kal is just a lesser form, the higher form, the less temperature. It's still hot. It's still considered some sort of libun that can be used with certain kelim that are in between. An in-between kelim would be, for example, a frying pan, which is already a suffix in itself. If the oil or the way it is being used is tantamount to dry fire, are you roasting, or is it like a form of bishul because of the little bit of liquid in the frying pan? So you can technically take that frying pan and put it into an oven, a regular oven that's not self-cleaning. But I wouldn't recommend it if you have, as we said, a rubber handle, which is going to melt. So, but technically anything that needs hagala can be put into an oven, a regular oven, where there will be libun kal, an easier form of libun, not necessarily the highest form of libun, because that would be in the equivalent, or very close to be hagala. So this is the way, kashering works. Other than using a torch, which is a higher form of libun, the next possibility, other than the ones we just mentioned, is ne'itza bekarka. So what was ne'itza bekarka? Ne'itza bekarka is, by the way, if we didn't clarify it enough, it involves, for the most part, sticking it 10 times, not once, maybe I wasn't clear, it's 10 times in the ground, and it's not a soft ground, not a ground that has, your gardener has come by and has moved the dirt around, and, the ground is loose. It has to be hardened. So the effect of the ne'itza in the ground will be to remove the shamnunis, to remove a little bit of the residues that the knife may have absorbed in the process of cutting. And when we say cutting, we explained that the knife, when a knife cuts, it has a let's call it a qualification, or that it does duchka de sakina. In other words, it has a certain koach, which is not, it's not close to being heat. It's definitely not heat, right? All it is cutting. It's sharpened as a sharp knife, cutting down with its weight, and it does something.
Then what would
you're
saying for that purpose?
Yeah, you're right. It could be. I mean, if you could use,
You don't even have the
you could put a fork. Yeah, the question is, would a fork qualify? What would be the din of a fork if you use that into a knife? If that is, there is a diyun. The person can speak about a fork, sticking a fork into a piece of meat versus a knife cutting through. If it accomplishes the same thing, does it have the exact same meaning or not? And I guess the majority of persons don't compare fork to knife. A knife is much more, it's a sharper.
Right, so we should have even good kashers.
Right, it does. A fork would not require that much. So, here in the last seif, when we were dealing with cutting through a hot piece of meat, it was a combination of the sakin and the hot piece of meat, as opposed to sticking a spoon or using a knife to smear the top with sauce. There was no duchka de sakina. So even though the meat was hot,
so with a fork or a spoon near to the karka, you should have hagala.
You wouldn't even need hagala. You wouldn't even need neitza bekarka. That's how lenient it may be. So neitza bekarka is more lenient than hagala, and if you don't need neitza bekarka, then you don't really need anything except to wash it out. And that's the few points that I wanted to add over here. That the shach brings down that if you use the knife not on a hot piece of meat, as the mechaber brings down, but you used it on something cold. Let's say you're cutting pastrami or something, right? Then you would not need a neitza bekarka. And he says the reason for that is because meat, as it is, is considered or deemed as something soft. It's not a very hard, unless of course you're dealing with something very, very hard. But meat usually by itself is not considered something so hard that therefore, were it to be cold, you wouldn't even need neitza bekarka. That's what the shach brings down. And what if it's a cham? But if it's a cham of kli sheni, then it would require neitza. So in the Ramah's words, "Aval himu kli sheni abosor tzorich klipa v'sakin neitza bekarka." Pretty much that's what the shach, I guess, goes along with. In other words, as opposed to who? As opposed to another shita that would hold that kli sheni is almost like a kli rishon for the most part, since we're dealing with the davar gush. So based on the shach, based on the Ramah, if you did use it on that knife on a piece of meat that was somewhat hot, at least yatsa lettuce before, then I would recommend neitza bekarka. You wouldn't have to do hagala. The question is, what's going to be easier for you? Go outside to your yard and start doing neitza bekarka, and the neighbor is looking at you? Yeah. Or just do it in your kitchen. Do the hagala anyway. So obviously these halachas are important because in case you don't have the ability to do hagala, you may be able to get away with it. B'shata dachak, shata tzorech, if there's a need to do it with just the neitza bekarka to clean that knife, versus going to bother to do hagala right now, Erev Shabbos. And you want to use that knife, of course. You want to continue to use that knife. No, that would be a problem. That would be for a variety of reasons. You don't want to start digging up your ground on Shabbos. Yeah. That was the other thing that I was thinking about. You're not allowed to be metak in the, but that's not a real tikkun. A real tikkun is agola. This is just to remove, as we said, the shanunis on it. It makes the knife usable. Yeah. It could be. That's what I meant by there would be several problems with it. Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah, that's what I meant by there would be several problems with it. That was one. Possible, because even we know that tvila on Shabbos is a problem because it's making something usable, so that cannot be done. So neither can you be machshir something. Of course not. Even if you have hot water, be metakin money. Yeah, so that could be an issue. But the bigger issue would be a deraisa possible, in the ground, even though it would come under the category perhaps of melacha she'eno tzricha legufa. You don't want the hole in the ground.
Right, but tikkun money.
Well, this is not exactly tikkun money in the sense of the melacha. The melacha that you're talking about is makeh bepatish. Makeh bepatish is not tikkun money. Not really, because makeh bepatish is the completion of something. You took something that was just made and you put it through cold water. In other words, that the cold water was a makeh bepatish. The last thing. Right. So that's a real melacha. That's a real melacha.
No.
Not tikkun moneh. Not tikkun moneh. Tikkun moneh is not a real melacha in the sense of how. No, not really. Not in the sense of how it is being used. For example, in Tvilas Kelim and all that. It's not a real melacha. It's not. Not in the way it is applied for what we're talking about. Preparing it for it to be used for Shabbos. No, that would not be. I don't see any melacha or toldo in this. You're welcome to investigate, but I don't. Yeah, I don't see it. And it's if anything, it's a derabanan. It's not a deraisa. Yeah. So anyway, so that was in the situation of kli sheni. So what happens if you cut cheese? So the shach makes a chiluk. That was because basar was davar rach relatively, but if it's a davar kosher, even if it even if it's tzoinen, it would require ne'itz. Since it's hard, cheese can be considered sometimes a hard piece of. And even if it's cold, he would say that one should make an ne'itza for it. Chochmas Sodom brings down. I saw that if there's a mokum tzarich, you have no time erev Shabbos, you could be maker, you could be lenient to do ne'itza only, even though that knife was used on something that was yatzalad this ball. In other words, he goes along with those shitas that you don't have to be machmer to do hagala for it. Because remember, we said that there are shitas that would hold a davar gush, a solid piece of meat, it would be almost like a kli rishon, and it would require hagala. But he says that you could always be soymechan on that, and those that hold that it's enough to do ne'itza b'karka. Okay, I think we can go on to Sif Ches and Sif Tes. Sif Ches and Sif Tes are very interesting. They're not your typical situation, and in Sif Ches there's actually a big question mark as to what the Mechaber really is talking about. He's definitely not making up his own halacha here. He's quoting the halacha from Rabbeinu Yerucham. This is what it reads, and I'm going to read it to you first, and let's see if you can figure it out on your own, what he's talking about. There's two ways of understanding what the Mechaber is saying. Im nofal letanur panadas. He's using here a Spanish word, panadas. If milk, something dairy, cheese, fell into an oven of panadas, so im nofal letanur panadas gvina, cheese, afilu locho, even if it's soft, v'chen, second in, gvina chama, a piece of hot cheese, fell onto a ke'arat basar bat yoma, fell into a hot fleishike bowl. In these two situations, eno ser ela kadei klipa. The most you have to deal with here is a klipa on the cheese, not more than that. Okay, so let's divide this. We have two dinim over here. What is he talking about in the first case? In the first case, is he talking about, as it appears, maybe, if one reads it, that we're having cheese falling into just an oven that is used for panadas? In other words, it's falling into some sort of container that is fleishiks? Or is that cheese actually falling into the fleishik food itself, the panadas itself? That's the question. We have two ways of interpreting. Some interpret this as the Mechaber is only talking about it is falling into a container of sorts, into an oven that is used to bake these panadas, which is a fleishik food. I think panadas may even be something like meatloaf. In other words, there's some bread involved, and it's obviously something fleishik. So that's one way of understanding it. Is he talking about that it's falling into just the kleili itself, or is he talking about that it actually fell on the panadas itself? So what would be the chiddush here? The chiddush here is that let's learn this as posh as the Beis Yosef learns it. If you look at the Beis Yosef and you look at the Shach, it seems to be that Rabbeinu Yerucham's din is that cheese has just fallen on the real meat, not just into a pot, not into a plate, a ke'ora, an oven, where this is baked or made. It actually fell on the meat itself. Then if that's the case, what would be so different about this than any other din of two hot foods coming together? We have the advantage of having learned that in Hilchos Taaruvot. Two hot foods touching. Or even if the top is cold, we have to talk over. I mean, what would be the chiddush over here? Why would he quote Rabbeinu Yerucham's din? Even though we're learning about Basar בחלב, yes, and we're talking about cheese and meat, yeah. But what would be the chiddush of Nofal, according to the first way of interpretation, Shach and Beis Yosef, that it's talking about a piece of cheese fell into the actual panadas itself, not just the tanur of panadas, but the actual meatloaf. If we use meatloaf as an example, it fell on the meat. What would be the chiddush? Well, the poshet chiddush would be that even though generally speaking, two hot foods, macholim, touching each other, coming to each other, we said, without roitev, without liquid, right? They require netila, that is how much we would have to remove from the cheese or from the meat. Here, the Mechaber says, all you need is kalipa. So the chiddush of Rabbeinu Yerucham would be, for some reason, cheese on meat without any liquid in between them, you don't need the standard netila. The Chazon Ish has a problem with learning it like this. He says, whoever told you that there's such a din, that cheese is different than all other macholim? How could you say that that's pshat? I mean, in order to say something like this, you need a makor, he says. The Chazon Ish says, in order to make such a chiddush, that cheese is different than all other foods, that when it comes in contact with flesh, with meat, it only needs klipa. We know the din is netila. Whoever told you that because this is cheese, the halacha would be different? So the Chazon Ish says that's not pshat in the din of Rabbeinu Yerucham. He's not talking about cheese falling on meat, but cheese falling on the container, on the kli that is being used to make these panadas. And it appears that that's the way the Taz learns too. So we have a Chazon Ish who argues on a shach. We have a Chazon Ish that pretty much goes along with the Taz. And with others, there are others who learn like that too. That Rabbeinu Yerucham's din is not talking about two foods touching each other. And that's why, if you read it, it says, in nafal tanur panadas. That's why it's tricky. It's hard to understand. The lashon is, it fell into an oven of panadas. It doesn't say the cheese fell on panadas itself. So some will tell you, yes, but the way to read or to interpret this is, it fell into panadas that is made in this, in such a place. In other words, and in such a tanur, you have panadas. And once you learn the second din, you must say that there has to be a difference between the first and second din. The second din is talking more about falling onto a ke'ora. So I would also venture to say the first one must be somewhat different than the second din in some major way. So that's why the shach goes ahead and says, yeah, the first din is talking about the real thing, Basar. So what's the chiddush according to Rabbeinu Yerucham, according to those who learn that it's actually falling on the meat? Yes, ordinarily two meats touching each other when they're very hot require netila. Here, because it's cheese, you only need a klipa. So without the Chazon Ish, why? Because cheese does not penetrate meat so much. The nature of cheese, even if it's soft, it just doesn't go. It doesn't penetrate too far. Or as the Pri Megadim further elaborates, that cheese by nature is chusho, he says. It is not such a moist thing. Most cheese, we're not talking about cottage cheese here, right? Cheese, Swiss cheese, is not really moist. And it's a gush kosher, he says. It's a solid block of something. In other words, a piece of cheese falling, when we mean cheese here, we're not talking about very, very, cottage cheese, ricotta cheese. We're talking about Swiss cheese. Cheese falling. Think about it. A piece of cheese fell onto meatloaf, meat, something of meat. How far would it go in? Go in far. So this would be the chiddush. That I don't know. Maybe I would assume it's also kedei netila. No, the chiddush is by cheese we're not machmer as much It always requires his kedibah. Now, what's going to be very interesting about this din, and the second din, the second halacha, is that the Ramah doesn't say anything. Now, you know the famous rule, and they have it in court as well. Well, actually, I don't know if they have it in court. They actually tell you have the right to remain silent. So that's different. By us, shtika kehoidah. Remember that, Ilan?
Sure.
What does that mean? If you're silent, that means you admit.
Anyone who would really voice his rejection.
Yeah. Right? So if you keep silent, does that mean you admit? In the court? No. But by us, it means that you obviously are not opposed to what is being said. You're not challenging.
On the other hand, if yourself, it's not.
Right, that's it. That's a separate thing.
If he's silent, it's not admissible.
Yeah.
If he accuses himself, it's not.
If there are no edim. Yeah, if there are no edim. So anyway, so the Ramah, he doesn't say anything. Does that mean he agrees? That's one of the questions here. An additional question. The Ramah doesn't say, I agree, I disagree. Our minig is different. Why?
Even if he, according to the Shachar, according to the Taaruvot.
Exactly, we don't know. Right. Either way, we don't know. The Ramah doesn't say anything. So some want to say, well, the reason, just because the Ramah doesn't say anything doesn't mean he agrees. He could be that the Ramah was relying on his psak elsewhere about similar situation, which we're going to talk about now. So I just wanted to give you the idea of why he doesn't say anything. There's always that possibility that the Ramah says, you know what, I don't have anything to say because I already told you my opinion about such matters, these kinds of circumstances elsewhere, in Basar B'Cholov, or in Taaruvot, or in both. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the Ramah. What issue could be? What issue would the Ramah have with it, with anything like this? The first issue that the Ramah does have, that we've covered already, was that today we're not becoming kochosh l'shaman. Do you remember that? We do know that something which is kochosh or something that is shaman can make it lean. I guess that's the best translation for kochosh.
Yeah.
Or shaman, fatty. These things make a difference because shaman, there's something called piapua. It travels, even though it's not boiling, it's not in a pot. This thing is greasy, it's fatty, and therefore, even though it's just touching, not being cooked together, it's still a big problem. We're not going to just say, oh, just take a kedina. No, if it's greasy, we're going to be machmer. So we have a famous Ramah elsewhere, Tzadik Aleph too, I think, that basically says, listen, today we're not bekim ben kochosh l'shaman. And therefore, in a similar situation there that the Mechaber brings down, when things are coming close contact, we don't know if something is kochosh or shaman. Therefore, we always have to be machmir and to require shishim. So, does that mean that the Ramah that gives us that halacha would therefore not say anything here because he holds we're machmir anyway, and therefore here we're not going to make a distinction? And we were going to require shishim because we don't know what the cheese is? Or are we going to say, well, that's in general. But cheese, according to everybody, should be a davar kochush. Perhaps, and there are some poskim who hold like that cheese is kochush. I mean, that's the way we were learning Poshet Pshat, the Mechaber, according to Rabbi Elyahu Kin's din. That's the chidush, that cheese is different. So perhaps, yes, we don't distinguish between kochush and shaman all over the place because we don't know meats. We can't know, is this meat fatty, is this meat not as fatty, or this item. But cheese, perhaps, everybody can somehow come to an agreement that it will be kochush because it's kochush betiv'ah, in its nature, in its actually essence. Perhaps it's different. Even though, remember, in Tzadik Aleph, it appears that he was machmer. There it appears that he's machmer. But maybe over here, for some reason, he's somewhat meko. Cheese is different. So that's the question as to how the Ramah. So there's a question on how the Ramah holds over here. He doesn't say anything, therefore he agrees. Or perhaps he's telling you, go ahead and remember what I wrote in Tzadik Aleph, that we are not experts in distinguishing between kochosh and shaman, and this would not be an exception either. Some say cheese is an exception. All right, so that would be concerning the panadas. Concerning the meat, the meatloaf, the most the cheese would penetrate is a kedei klipa, according to the Mechaber, but the Shach says, wait a minute, that's just the meat. The cheese itself, you have to remove a kedei natila, if the basar is kochush. Why? Because the basar's tam, going back into the cheese, penetrates at kedei natila, just like we've learned all over the place. two hot things touching each other. So the basar will go back kedei netila. The question was the cheese, how much does it go? So the Mechaber doesn't talk about that. So the Shach adds the cheese, and it appears like there are many poskim hold the same. The cheese, you would have to remove a kedei netila if you have a block of cheese, a cheese that fell. We're not talking about a slice of American cheese. You would have to throw it out. According to everybody, pretty much, whether it's a klipa, it's how much do you have in a slice of American cheese? You basically have, at the most, I mean, you have about a kedei klipa, maybe a little bit more. I don't even know if it's a kedei netila. But one slice falling on meat, hot, right? You would have to throw out the cheese, and the meat, you would remove a kedei klipa according to what we just learned. If it's a block of cheese, you would be able to slice, remove a little piece of it. How much? The Shach says it would be a kedei netila. So meat going back into the kedei netila, the cheese going into the meat, or meatloaf, is only kedei klipa. Alright, so now let's go back to the Chazon Ish. So this is how we were learning Pshat, that we were talking about cheese falling onto the meat itself, the meat directly. The Chazon Ish has a problem with that, says they can't be that's the din. You know, as far as we know, oichlim, if it would be oichlim touching each other, foods touching each other, is a kedei netila. That cannot be the din over here. And so the Chazon Ish says over here we're talking about, Rabbi Yeruchim is talking about, it's oichelin kli. Food and a pot. Food and a frying pan. Food and a plate. You know, a keli. Not food and food. Oh, if you're talking about food and kelim, vessels, plates, oh, of course. I can understand that. The keli is not as strong to emit the flavor if you're not cooking in it. It's hot. It's a hot platter. Hot platter, hot food, I can understand. With cheese, you can have, or with other foods, all you have is a klipa. A kli is hard, does not emit as much as food. Very simple. So what's the chiddush over here? Other foods with kelim, it would be the same. There's something that comes out. Yes, we've learned that. The Shach speaks a lot about that. That tam can come out of the keli if it's hot, and the food is hot. Yes, some, depending on if it's shaman, if it's not shaman, depending if they're both hot or not. So what's the chiddush here according to the Chazon Ish? If this is it, I mean, okay, big deal. So it's a klipa. Okay, fine. No, the chiddush is that with cheese, even if it's moist, that's the chiddush over here, because he says that in the halacha, afilu locha, right? Even if it's moist, moist. Yes, that's the chiddush. That's the chiddush with this din of cheese. That even if the cheese is moist, you might think you need more than a klipa is enough. In other words, as far as the keli itself, also, the moist cheese will not answer the whole keli, just a little bit. It makes a big difference. Remember, we spoke about it. Sometimes, it's something that requires a klipa, you forgot to take off a klipa, or you can't take off a klipa. How do you take off a klipa from a kli? So this could make a difference on if you, by mistake, cooked without removing a klipa, if the klipa is meikar adin, or it's only a chumrah. But that's the way the Chazon Ish explains it over here. Klipa, yes, we're talking about food with keli, not food with food. And here, whether it's the keli or whether it's the food itself, the most it penetrates is a klipa. And what's the chiddush? That's the din. No, the chiddush here is that even if the cheese is more. So he says that you cannot say it's talking about food and food. No. Whoever told you need a klipa just because it's cheese? No. Food and food is kedei netila. If here it's kedei klipa, it's talking about food and a keli. And what's the chiddush? The chiddush is the cheese is moist. And even if it's moist, it doesn't go beyond the klipa either way, into the food or into the keli. The Shach makes an additional chiluk, an important chiluk, that as far as food and kelim, if the food is moist versus not being moist. If the food is moist, you do need a kedei netila. If the food is not moist, if it's no guv legamre, if it's dry completely, then a klipa would be sufficient. So therefore, in this case of the Mechaber, he would hold that if we're talking about, he holds different. He holds that we're talking about the actual meat anyway. But if there would be a case where this would be a keli, and the cheese would moist, then it would require kedei netila. In other words, even though food and keli is not as problematic as food and food, but if the food is moist, you take off a netila. If the food is not moist, if it's completely dry, a kedei klipa would be sufficient. The second din, in the Mechaber and Sif Ches, was the Gvina Chama, the hot cheese, fell into Ke'ara. That everybody appears to understand. It means just a Ke'ara, Basar Bas Yoima, to make things more difficult. He's telling us that it was a Bas Yoima, of course. It's a Ke'ara this time, not food. Eino Oise Ela Kedei Klipa. So here, if you look at the Shach, you look at the Beis Yosef, this din is not from Rabbeinu Yerucham. This din he infers from Rabbeinu Yerucham's previous din. In other words, the Beis Yosef simply says that since we're talking about a keli here, the keli is not going to be any worse than food with food. If by the cheese and the food and the panadas all you had was a kedei klipa, then if you have this cheese in contact with the metal of the pot, of the pan, or whatever, it's not going to be any worse. Right? More than what the cheese is nivla in it. In other words, you can have the bli of the cheese into the pot so much, the kli would not emit more than that into the kivino itself. In other words, how much? Either as much or less, but not more. So therefore he tells us this separate din, that if we're dealing with cheese falling on a hot, empty pot, fleshike pot, it would only also kedei klipa as well. This second din, the Ramah would agree, the Shach says, because that's the din that we've learned already before, that a keli itself will never answer food that you put into it more than a kedei klipa if it's dry. So let's say you have a pot sitting in the fire, on the burner. You turn it on the fire. It's hot. It's getting hot. And you start putting in, I don't know, you start putting in the potatoes, or actually no, we start putting in cheese because it's basar b'chalab. Let me see if that would be a good example, because eventually the cheese would. So, in a situation where it did not melt, a situation where perhaps it's not directly on the fire, but it's hot. Let's see, what will be a good example? I guess something that maybe perhaps a better example would be something that was removed from the fire pot. It's still hot, and you put something in there. Either way, whatever you're putting in there, you're not putting it in there with liquid. You're not putting it in there with liquid. The tam of the pot that will be emitted into the cheese or into the food that's being cooked in there would be kedei klipa. Because that's the famous rule that we've covered many, many times, that without roitav, without liquid, the tam, the traveling of the tam is pretty limited how far it can go.
If it's a starter piece that's melting,
Right.
you have to remove all from the piece that's melting.
Well, once something has melted, it's become liquid.
No, it's
Right? It's in that stage, yeah.
That stage where
Yeah, you would have to remove the melted too.
and the klipa.
And the klipa too, sure. That's what I would suggest, yeah, because, the melted is already a different consistency altogether than the hard cheese. The whole chiddush over here that we're talking about is that the food, the cheese, does not penetrate too far. Once something changes its consistency, I guess, it becomes more of a liquid. There's a question in Hilchos Shabbos about lach, something that is liquid. As you know, there's a famous machlokes that you cannot rewarm liquid. The difference between Ashkenazim and Sephardim is that Ashkenazim hold that as long as it was not cooled off completely, if it's still lukewarm, you could rewarm it. Mm-hmm. And the Sephardim hold with the opinion that if once it's cooled off, you cannot rewarm it at all. Right. Because there is a shita that holds that even if it's cold,
right,
once it's cooked, it's cooked. Ein bishul achar bishul, afilu belach. We don't hold like that. We're machmer. Even though something has cooled off, we don't recook it on Shabbat. Now, what happens if you take fish from the refrigerator that you put away Friday night, and Shabbos day you want to rewarm it? On the blech, of course, and not directly on the fire either. But you'll be worried. The problem that you will be encountering, however, is even though it's fish, which is a davar yavesh, is that the fish has sauce. And sauce is lach. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef deals with this question. And he's had various opinions about the amount of rotev, the amount of sauce. It appears to be in one psak that he says, it's usually you just have a little bit of sauce, that's not called liquid. And lately somebody told me that he changed his psak, that even a little bit of rotev could constitute lach. So you have to be careful. If there's really a good amount, substantial amount of sauce, that it may be liquid. It's not just a little bit of sauce over the fish. It could be that the whole thing is sitting in a little bit of sauce. It could be the halacha will be different. So you have to be careful that you should not rewarm it in a place where it will become yat soledet both. That's the whole problem. Okay, where it will become yat soledet. If it's a place which is going to little bit warm up, it's never going to become yat soledet. It's not a problem. It's a problem where it can become yat soledet. It can become hot. So that's liquid. The sauce, even though it has some solids in it, tomatoes or whatever, it is considered a liquid for Hilchos Shabbos, and it would be considered a liquid if you're cooking something in it in a pot. Just like it would be water, or it would be oil, or any other thing, depending, of course, how much oil. But once you have a certain amount, I guess that's enough for the tam to transfer from the food to the kli, and from the kli to the both ways. Yeah. Anyway, so in the second din of the mechaber, where for sure we see that it's falling onto a ke'ara, baso bas yama, even the Ramah would agree that it will only aser kedei klipa, and you wouldn't need more than that, because we're talking about a food into a keli. And food into a keli, the time of the keli going into the food would not go out more than a kedei klipa, because there's no roitiv. All right, let's see the last seif of Siman Tzadik Dalet. Seif Tes. This one is fun. Why is it fun? Because we've seen it in Hilchos Taaruvot a little bit when we talked about honey. Remember the mice falling in and all those goodies? Yeah. Doisen tam levgam. What do you do if a fly fell into the soup? Besides Hilchos Shabbos, can you eat the soup? Yeah, occasionally I get a question. Fell into the soup. Could I eat? I wouldn't. It's not a halachic thing. But you have to know. Well, maybe it is a question. If it's a black widow, you mean? Yeah. So anyway, so that's what these halachas are all about. We got to know. The Hilchos Shabbos is a separate question, but the tam, is there tam? We're not talking about being bottled. You're taking it out. You see it. The question if it leaves over something. As you know, when it comes to honeys, to honey, even though it's processed through a bee, it's not asur. We learn it out from Psukim, right? That even though it's a sheretz, the bee is a sheretz.
Right.
And it's called dover haba min hasheretz. And the dover haba min hatoma is tome too. But there are exceptions. Just like there's an exception with milk in a sense. That's
something else.
It's a little bit different. Not only is ever min achai, but it's dam shene'ekar v'nase cholov. What's cholov? What's milk? Blood shenek. In other words, it's been somehow processed in the system of the cow and has been transformed into milk. So it really is blood. But anyway, that's a little bit different because that is a whole transformation in a cow. Besides the Iver min achai thing. So here we have like this. In Siftes we have bishlu dvash b'machmas shel basar. Okay, somebody made honey, frying honey or cooking honey, as it says here, in a frying pan, a fleishike frying pan. You're allowed to. Why would he be doing that? I wonder what dish they're preparing. I would venture to say they're melting it to make baklava. Maybe. You know what baklava is, right? Right? So you want to use some honey and you want to melt it. You don't have ready-made honey in a jar, and somehow you want to maybe melt it. You're cooking it. So bishul dvash b'machmas shel basar. You use the fleishike pot to cook honey. The pot, and the fleishike pot was a bas yom, of course. Okay, so, well, after he cooked the honey, melted the honey, cooked the honey, warmed up the honey, hirikuhu cham b'ke'oro shel cholov bas yom. They poured it hot into a Melicha bowl that was a bas yom too. Oh no! What now? So the balabasta comes and asks, what to do? What's the problem? Well, the problem is, first of all, what's the din of the vash? What's the din of the pot? The Melicha pot? Yeah, you have to. What could I make with it? I mean, what could I eat it with? There's a lot of shilas over here. So this shaila is a little bit different than the typical. That's where we have a special din, halacha about it. It's not your regular halacha of pouring something from a fleishike pot like water. Because the din of pouring, we will see next siman. The din of pouring from one fleishiks to a Melicha pouring, and so the pouring creates a nitzuk, a chibur. It creates a connection in a sense. It is serious. It's even more serious than actually washing, rinsing the two pots in the same sink. You're pouring from one to another. You're connecting the two. So what's so unique about this halacha? So this Seif Tes is an halacha from the Mordechai. And the Mordechai basically says like this: this halacha of pouring will not give you such a big headache. You know why? Because we're dealing with honey here. So, well, honey, if it absorbed the tam of meat in honey is poigim the honey. The tam of meat is poigim the honey. Remember that from before? In the previous Gilgul, we learned that. Hilchos Taaruvot. Honey can become poigim. It can become tasteless, or not even tasteless. It can become ruined by certain flavors, additives that are added to it. Now, you know there's different kinds of honey. There's orange blossom honey.
So you're saying it becomes pogum, or
the honey becomes pogum.
honey?
In other words, the tam of basar is poigim the honey. Now, I told you about orange blossom honey. There's all these ways of processing honey that actually gives it a flavor. It enhances it. You know, there's different ways of making that. And it actually tastes good. There's a tradition, somehow, not everybody agrees with it, that meat, not only does it not enhance it, it's poigim the dvash. It actually ruins it. It ruins the whole tam of honey. There is such a shita. Many hold by that basar is poigim the tam of dvash. That's important to know. It's important to know if it's an iser. Not only basar here, it's important to know if it's an iser. If something is poigim, we need to know about that because it can make a difference. So the Mordechai seems to be saying that that's all. That here, in this case, you made the honey. Before you came out, you were talking about why would somebody cook honey in a frying pan? Maybe he wants to make baklava. Why would he want to fry honey? You know of any dishes where you fry the honey or cook the honey in a pot?
No.
Oh yeah? You first fry the honey? You prepare the honey? Yeah? I never made it, so I don't know.
You can
Yeah. So do you know of any such dish? Anyway, that's what we're talking about here. That he cooked it in a machos, but he used a fleishike pot and then he poured it into a melicha pot. Mutar. Now the mechaber, what's interesting is the mechaber doesn't make for some reason the Mordechai's reason. He gives his own. He gives his own reason that he talks about in the Bes Yosef. You know why it's mutar after you poured it into a melicha pot? You don't have to worry about it. Mishum de have noisen tam bar noisen tam de hetera. Nothing to do about noisen tam lefgam, which is the Mordechai says. The Mordechai is the one that tells us this halacha that comes along the mechaber. Hey, I have another reason I want to share with you. Not that he disagrees with the other one. This is, in reality, he says this is an additional reason. So why only mention this? That's a question on the mechaber. If you say that this is an additional reason, mention both. If you disagree, I can understand. All right, but he doesn't. I don't think he doesn't really disagree. The Bes Yosef holds that this is an additional reason why you don't have to be worried about this honey, because it's noisim tam bar noisim tam, not by not, which is one of the main topics of the next Siman Tzadik Hey, which Hashem we're going to start Thursday. That's where we find that when you have a second generation, if we can call it, of tam, in other words, it traveled from the pot into the honey, from the honey into the second pot. It's so diluted, it's so chalash, it's so weak tam, it's not a real tam. And that would apply here too. The Mechaber says that this is a not banat hetera, this is not a problem, you don't have to worry about it, go ahead and use it however you want to. It's a regular not banat. Regular not banat according to the Mechaber, remember, means you don't have a problem with the pot, the second pot, neither do you have a problem with the honey. You can use it however you want to use it. Actually, with the honey itself, it would be a little bit different. The din should be a little bit different than the pot, because the real not bar not, some may claim, would apply to the pot, the Melicha pot. The honey itself came directly from the pot, the fleishike pot. So it was cooked in a fleishike pot. It's fleishike honey. There, for that, you want to add the first reason of the Mordechai. Yeah, but wait a minute. Even though it was cooked in a fleshike pot and it's not a nat bar nat, but it's a tam lifgam. Noten tam lifgam would apply to the honey, so it would not be called fleshike honey. The noten tam lifgam reason of the Mordechai means that this honey is not called fleshike honey. That's what it means. Just that he's talking right now more about the pot. Let's not talk about noten tam lifgam, he says. I want to talk about the pot. The pot is also okay for another reason, and that's called nat bar nat. Very interesting.
From the actual honey separate.
Right.
And that's it.
Right.
The actual honey comes warm it up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mean when they process it?
Right.
They prepare it. Yeah. From the beehive.
Right. I don't know.
Yeah? Yeah, it could be the initial
Right.
process. Could be, yeah, I didn't think about that. It could be that when they're first preparing it.
Right. It's like sit on the bottom and then the actual.
Yeah. All right. So now what? On this last seif, which appears to be relatively straightforward, there's no Ramah either. Just like we didn't have a Ramah on the first seif, in Seif Ches. On this seif, there's no Ramah. And so the Shach asks, where are you? He asks of the Ramah that it appears you agree again with the Mechaber. And you can't agree with the Mechaber. You don't agree about nat bar nat. Not only that, this is irui. He's pouring from a hot pot, fleshike pot, into a milchike pot, and that irui you will later on tell us that in some ways it's at least like rinsing fleshike and milchike pots together, which is a problem because the waters are mixing. There's no nat bar nat. Irui is even worse because in an irui you have a chibur. You have nitzuk. It's called nitzuk. It's connected. The water is connecting the top to the bottom. And this is a kiluach or nitzuk sheno nifsak, which is even the more, it's uninterrupted. There is a kiluach which we spoke about several months ago where it stops. Okay, some could be more lenient. But here, this is a much more serious kiluach situation. So where's the Ramah? Why doesn't the Ramah say anything? At least, say what you hold in Siman Tzadik Hey, that this wouldn't apply. Now, there's another reason why the Ramah should say something. As far as the nois and tam lefgam of the Mordechai, on that he has something to say too. In Siman Kuf Gimel, Taaruvot, by din nois and tam lefgam, there he brings down that there are some shitas who hold that Basar is not poigem dvash. V'yesh omrim the Basar eno pogem dvash atzmo. The only thing that it is pogem is called mashke hanaasa midvash. There's a drink. You remember the name of that drink? I forgot the name of it. Yeah, meat. Yeah, kind of a meat. Yeah. It's a drink that's made of honey. So the flavor of meat will ruin that, but the flavor of meat will not necessarily ruin just honey itself. The Mokum Shein Efsed, he says, one should be stringent. He says meat. Then he goes on to say meat or milk in yain have a lifgam in mutar, but in vash not everybody agrees that it's nois and tam lifgam. So very interesting. So the Shach has a good question here. Why doesn't Ramah argue for a variety of reasons he wouldn't agree with this din, the last din? Either it's not nat bar nat, it's iroi, if anything. You're pouring? This is not this. Plus, as far as nois and tam lifgam, there are some shittas that don't hold that basar is that dvash, basar in dvash is not. So what's the answer? The possibility of the answer, the Shach himself, by the way, says this. He says, wait a minute. It could be here for some reason he allows himself to go ahead and say the Ramah does not really oppose the Machaber, because here you have two reasons. You have more of a reason to be matir. The dvash, the basar in the dvash that is poigem, that's not according to everybody. Some people are machmir. Nat bar nat also is a chumrah, the way that he proposes it there. So therefore, here you have two halachas that are not really me'ikar hadin, being combined together. Two reasons being combined together. There's a machlokes on both of them. So since there's a machlokes in both of them, if you are mitzaref the two together, you combine the two together, it could be that because of this, the Ramah is mekel here. So on this last halacha, it could be the Ramah has nothing to say, because he would agree. Why? Even though he's machmir, but here you have two chumras. When you have two chumras, you put them together, it's okay, you don't have to be machmir. The Taz, however, makes a good point. The Taz makes a good point telling us, well, it's important to know that there are two explanations here. Because I can give you a situation where only one will apply, not the other. What's that? If you cook the meat in a pot that had meat, and you cook the honey where there was basar be'ein, you know what happens then? You don't have nat bar nat, but you still have nois and tam nefgam. So the Taz says, the Mechaber should have said, that's why they have a question, why didn't you say the other tam too? I can give you a situation where you'd only be left with that. So anyway, it's mashro from the Beis Yosef that this is just an additional tam. That enochiname, yes, that dvash, tam of basar in dvash is a noise tam of dam, and therefore this honey will not be fleshik. I think personally, if is that he's really not so much concerned with honey right now. The honey, what am I going to do about the honey right now? He's more concerned about the pot. You pour it into a pot, and that's the last seif of Tzadik Dalet going into Siman Tzadik Hey. He basically wants to remind us we're going into the waters of Nat Bar Nat. So get used to this idea of that this is a typical situation of Nat Bar Nat too. Even though it's Irui, he's still Mako. This would be an additional reason by itself that you won't have to worry. That's a big chiddush. Because remember, you're pouring, and you would think I'm pouring for a flesh pot directly, this water, the honey, whatever, anything, you're pouring directly here. It's true, and they both would talk about Bnei Yom. Of course, we're talking about Bnei Yom, right? Still, that's considered a nat bar nat. And once something is a nat bar nat, you don't have to be machmer, according to Mechaber. The Ashkenazim are machmer, the Ramah is machmer. In other words, when there are cases where you can be maker by nat too, even by Ashkenaz. But the criteria for nat bar nat, constitutes a real nat bar nat, that's Mit Hashem will be learning in Siman Tzadik Hey. But for now, this din is a chidush. It's good to know this because in case you're pouring, you may not be pouring honey, you're making melting chocolate, by the way. That happens all the time in my house. And I think they've used fleshik kapad. I have to ask my wife what she'd use. Because, not that she's going to make a fleshiks, but, these kinds of questions come up. Can I use this pot? Can I use this pot? We're making something parva, of course. You know how you melt chocolate. A low flame. There's actually, you put one pot into another pot. In Spanish, it's called baño Maria. In Spanish. In other words, you have a pot of water boiled on a low flame, and into this pot of water, you put another small pot where you melt the chocolate, because you don't want to melt the chocolate over the flame directly.
They get the powder.
Well, obviously, there's different recipes. Right. Here we're talking about making lollipops, making all kinds of things in shapes. You want the chocolate melted. So the questions of when you're making something parv always comes up. What should I make it in?
Chocolate
what should I make it in? You're making something parv. Should I make?
Chocolate powder is there.
Yeah.
Belgium.
Okay, I'll try to remember that. But anytime you're making something parv, you want to know. Or sometimes you want, where should I make it in? Well, it all depends on what you plan to eat. If you don't plan to eat Melicha, and it's going to be a completely parva meal, you can make it in any pot you want.
There's halacha
Yeah. Right.
because the dvash is so sensitive.
Apparently, yeah. Apparently, dvash is more sensitive, and therefore some things can be poigamim.
Would it therefore be applicable as a taste like chocolate?
Yes, of course. Yeah. I just gave you the example. There are more mentions over there that in wine, meat or milk would be poigamim. Either of the two. Basar or chalav b'yayin havelifgam u'mutar. In other words, on that there's no discussion. Meat or milk in wine just doesn't go together. So there are certain things, when we talked about nois and tam, we've got to remember there are certain things that are pogam me'atzmam, they themselves are already pogam, right? And there are certain combinations that the chemical reaction of putting the two together produces a bad tam in that particular liquid or food. And either way, it's pogam.
doesn't like wine?
It can, sure. It will give you a completely bad taste, and this is important to know if you're dealing with an Isser. Here we have the advantage, in some cases it's an advantage, a benefit, that we're talking about hetera. And in hetera you have nat barnat. In Isura you don't have that advantage of nat barnat, as we would. So it's like the Mechaber, like the Basar says, and in addition to the Hesber by honey of Noisin Town of God, which apparently he agrees, here, because he's also concerned about the pot, I give you another reason. It's also a nat barnat. So there would be no concern about this. So, Mr. Hashem, we'll see the halachas of nat barnat in the next
I used to have a roommate that told him.
In the cholent?
Yeah.
Of course. You have to have onion in the cholent. You don't put...
Honey.
Oh, honey? Oh, yeah. There are some recipes that call for honey. We've tried it too. Honey, ketchup to sweeten it a little bit. Yeah. Sweet paprika. Yes, definitely. You sometimes want to balance the taste, not too hot.
Typically, if you make something too spicy, they can't handle it.
Right.
So they need it. You don't want to throw out a whole bunch.
Sure.
You make. If you add some sweet sugar,
Yeah, that can do it.
it'll actually
Neutralizing, yeah.